Now, on Race to Save the Planet, what does the environment mean in 3 very different countries? And how do you get things done? In Sweden, for example.
Governmental agencies are nothing without people chasing them.
Can Zimbabwe juggle competing needs of villagers, tourists, farmers, and wildlife? How did Thailand handle its population problem? Will Sweden show how to cope with the modern world? For every country, it needs political decisions.
Major funding for Race to Save the Planet is provided by the Annenberg CPB project and public television viewers. Corporate funding is provided by Ocean Spray. Our continuing aim is to preserve and protect what we cannot create. Additional funding is provided by Jesse Smith Noyes Foundation, Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, and Carnegie Corporation of New York, and by the following.
What does the environment mean to people around the world? Do they worry about the same things everywhere? In this episode of Race to Save the Planet, we tried to find out. It's about the environment in Zimbabwe, Sweden, and Thailand, countries with widely differing cultures, resources, and wealth. Their environmental problems are quite different too, but perhaps the most interesting thing is that all 3 recognize that solving them is the key to their future. And in all 3, governments are discovering that they must respond to the environmental demands of their people.
Independence Day in Zimbabwe. Compared to much of Africa, people here are well off. But the future is far from certain. Population is growing rapidly, wildlife is dwindling, and farmland is under pressure. Familiar problems in Africa, with common colonial origins.
When Zimbabwe was colonized, most of the land with better soils, better rainfall, and better everything was taken up by the rulers, and in fact even better climate. There used to be a description which said certain parts of Zimbabwe were suitable for European settlement. So all these were taken up, and the indigenous people who used to be in these areas were then pushed down to the marginal areas where they were just heaped there in a very, very haphazard manner. No land use planning, and very little attention was paid to their settlement patterns.
This pattern of segregation extended throughout the country, then called Rhodesia. The white minority clung to its life of privilege, but against growing opposition. Race riots were soon to follow.
The demonstrations took place in the heart of Salisbury itself, where previous trouble has been confined to the African townships. The rich citadel of European supremacy has watched scenes reminiscent of Birmingham, Alabama, as police used dogs to help disperse the crowds.
By the late 1970s, there was full-scale civil war. The bloody fight for black majority rule was to leave many scars, and the determination that the government would be different, that it would listen to the people. In spite of the war, the newly independent Zimbabwe was off to a good start, with living standards among Africa's highest. In order to keep it that way, the country's leaders made a critical decision. The former colonists white settlers, were encouraged to stay. The better white-owned land, now called commercial farms, is still the most productive. Intensive agriculture, growing export crops like fruit and coffee, earns vital foreign exchange, but at a price. The majority of the African population are still crowded into the so-called communal lands. Rainfall is lower, the soil less fertile. Many cattle are raised as well. The result is that the overstressed communal lands are deteriorating fast. Some areas are already desert. But cattle here have a special significance, as President Mugabe acknowledges.
By tradition, we look at cattle as wealth in themselves. And every family would want to be seen to be that cattle wealthy. And each member of the family aspires to having some cattle. So then, you have a situation where these aspirations, you see, will lead to a cattle population which cannot be sustained by the environment in the particular area.
Restrictions on cattle would make environmental sense, but they're politically impossible. There are bitter memories of colonial attempts at compulsory cattle limits, conservation by coercion. Not surprisingly, it failed, and the land suffered.
As a result of lack of proper conservation policies in the communal areas, you ended up with two Zimbabwe's, as it were. One section which is well conserved and the other one which is just a semi-desert. If you moved from a commercial area into a communal area, it was like you are moving from one country into another country, and yet this was all the same country.
Now, conservation is a top government priority, and in contrast to colonial days, education is the means.
The president, who has always made sure he planted a tree since the inauguration of National Tree Day in 1980, planted a lemon tree to mark the beginning of the tree planting season.
We take for granted that since we were born on a world with trees, on a world with animals, the animals and the trees shall always continue to be there, no matter how much devastation we do to them. No, nature is not like that. When we devastate it, it will come back and revenge and devastate us.
Demetria Shigweshi is on the front line of another education campaign, perhaps the government's most critical. If it fails, all the efforts for conservation will have been in vain. The campaign is to control Zimbabwe's skyrocketing birth rate, one of the highest in the world. The government-written song, taught to the women by Demetria, encourages determination to give up the traditional large families. As with the land conservation policy, this is a delicate issue for the government. Coercion is simply out of the question.
I don't think that we can, with any degree of certainty, say 4 to a family would be the number that we require. I think we would rather leave it to the families so to decide, and also traditionally it wouldn't be acceptable to set the family size.
This is Africa's most comprehensive population program. There's health education, because healthy children survive. So a mother won't feel compelled to bear more than she ultimately wants. There's careful instruction on contraception. Use has doubled to 40% since independence. Every village in the country has its own family planning worker. She's a familiar and trusted figure, and that's important because as she offers advice on proper spacing of births or the higher cost of a large family, she is playing the role that traditionally belongs to a grandmother.
We teach them the benefits of a small family, and we always show them examples of small families who have better life in living. and to have better education so that they can admire and see for themselves that this is true. We are trying to teach them that the land does not grow. It's us who are growing. The places which used to be our fields have all been filled up by people. That means there will be no land to till, no land for the pastures for our animals, and there will be nothing to help ourselves.
There is a final frontier in Zimbabwe, the magnificent 30,000 square mile Zambezi River Valley. Even if the population program is a total success, in 50 years, numbers will double. 9 million more people to provide for. Inevitably, they will turn to the valley, one of Africa's last relatively untouched wilderness areas, where many animals are still abundant. So far, people have avoided this land for a specific reason. It is infested with the tsetse fly, carrier of sleeping sickness which attacks people and especially cattle. But the wildlife is naturally immune. Now there's a major government campaign to eradicate the fly, opening up the valley to farmers and their cattle from the overcrowded communal areas. But the scheme is an environmental gamble. Not only is the wildlife threatened, but much of the soil is so marginal that the deterioration already seen elsewhere in the country could easily be repeated. Tsetse control teams use a method devised to minimize environmental impact. Bottles filled with synthetic cattle scent are positioned on black cloth targets, which in turn are sprayed with insecticide. Flies attracted by the scent will land on the target and be killed, avoiding the need for widespread spraying. John Barrett is a government planner.
Okay, the cattle, you only have 2 cattle. When did you buy those?
I bought this cattle 2 years ago.
Okay. And before that, did you ever have cattle before?
The government is trying to make plans for the inevitable development here. But just as with the communal lands and the population program, it will try to use education to influence the process.
And how long did that take?
That means first understanding the situation from the settlers' point of view.
Okay, here's the interesting question. Why did you buy cattle?
For draft power.
Right. But why did you not buy cattle before?
There were tsetse flies.
Because of the tsetse flies?
Yes, so we didn't.
So far, the TSETSE program has been perhaps too successful. In some areas, cattle numbers are doubling every 2 years. Population in the valley is going up fast as well. The country's conservationists foresee a grim future for the valley.
The eradication of the fly in terms of the Zambezi Valley is a cataclysmic event, because it's for the first time in history we're going to get a rapid influx of people and cattle. And that could easily get out of hand, because when you've got a government under pressure to basically find land for people, they find land in the here and now. Where we will be in 20 and 30 years' time could be a different story.
If Zambezi Valley development is going to succeed in the long run, the planners must achieve a precarious balance between people, agriculture, cattle, land, vegetation, and wildlife.
Nobody would argue that uncontrolled settlement of too many people and the introduction of too many livestock would undoubtedly have a major adverse effect on the environment of the valley. What we're not sure is what is the right level at which to plan human settlement and agriculture, that the resulting farming system should be sustainable.
The valley has inspired debate within government. Which should take priority? Land for people or wildlife worth cash to the country?
3/4 of our tourism is based on the Zambezi Valley. Most of our game parks are in the Zambezi Valley. Then you have, of course, things like the Victoria Falls, the Kariba, which are big international attractions. And therefore, from the point of view of environment, we would like to see very little change taking place in the Zambezi Valley.
Best shot is on the point of the shoulder in the bottom half of the buffalo, in fact in the bottom third preferably. Don't go too low, otherwise you shoot into the brisket.
Professional hunter Duff Gifford is teaching a client to shoot. It's part of a radical experiment to preserve wildlife, but also provide income for villagers who are here to learn the safari trade. Regulated hunting could be worth more than agriculture, indefinitely.
At the moment, it's the only endeavor that I can think of that can immediately and quickly and comprehensively put a value on the animal. Wealthy people spend a lot of money for the privilege of coming out hunting.
Clients are glad to pay a $5,000 trophy fee to shoot an elephant, not endangered in Zimbabwe, or $1,000 for a Cape buffalo. This money used to end up in the National Treasury, but under a recent government decision, it now goes directly to the local villagers. They own the wildlife, the trophy fees it generates, the safari camp income, even the meat from the hunt. The hope is that this policy will inspire in people a real interest in conserving wildlife.
The people have never owned their resource. Why should they look after it? It's never been theirs. All they've seen is the, safari operator or great white hunter with his silk scarf fluttering in the wind and in a brand new Land Cruiser, who then tells him, oh, you must look after your animals because they're worth a lot of money. Well, to whom? Not to him they aren't. To the white hunter at that stage, yes. But now that the animals are worth a hell of a lot more to him because they belong to him.
Here, village members and their own wildlife committee are now getting to know the new value of their local environment. They are listening as a representative of a conservation group explains how giraffes can translate into tractors.
Ukatengesa dzese nyati 24 idzo unaiona $24,000. Yaikwanisa kutenga tractor mari iyoyo. Hino kana imimi panapa muchiti no tiri kuda kodya nyama yenyati mari yenyu iyi ya 24,000 yadzika kuenda ku 23.
Already in the first week of the scheme, the villagers are becoming decidedly protective of their property. The Zambezi Valley, in many ways, stands for the whole of Zimbabwe. Unlike much of Africa, the environment is still healthy. The hope is that if the people are involved in its future, through education, advice, incentives, then it will continue to sustain a relatively prosperous way of life. The country has come through the trauma of independence with success, only to confront an ever greater challenge. Above all, Zimbabwe must meet the threat of more and more people, potentially enough to overrun the Zambezi Valley, devastate the communal lands, undermine commercial farming, and the government itself. But it is not an impossible task, as other countries have shown. One is Thailand. It's one of the oldest civilizations in Asia. As they've done for the last 2,000 years, people from across the country gather in the capital every spring to celebrate Royal Plowing Day, marking the beginning of the rainy season and the start of the agricultural year. The king is a crucial unifying force, whose presence lends special powers to the rice seed which is broadcast across the field. He leads one of the only countries in Asia never to have been a colony. In modern Thailand, the king shares power with the prime minister and parliament, but his ideas still tend to influence government policy. Nevertheless, Thailand is still a traditional Asian culture, where people have faith that a few grains of the king's sacred rice will bring a good harvest. Thailand is one of Asia's so-called newly industrializing countries, with an economy racing ahead at 10% a year. Prosperity is founded on one critical achievement. In a mere 15 years, population growth was halved from a rate that was once the same as Zimbabwe's. Devised by an imaginative government economist, the program was based on education, but with an unconventional twist.
We went to the people and told them that having too many children is really a tough thing for the future. Land is limited, but the numbers that you think you should be your decision. So we didn't tell them you only have 2, you should only have 3, but it was the principle that life would be better or wouldn't be as bad if we limited our fertility. And we have many, many uses of the condom. As you can see, one, you can use it as a tourniquet for snake bites and deep cuts. You can use it to cover a gun to stop sand from going into it. You can, of course, put coins and change into here, or Coca-Cola if you like. And, of course, you can use it as a balloon for young children. And naturally, there's a band at the end. Don't throw it away. You can use it as a hairband. We told them that this is just a wonderful piece of rubber. Don't be embarrassed by it. The condom is clean if your mind isn't dirty. Therefore, here, look at it, touch it. It's just simple rubber. It's a wonderful product. And then we said, let's show how convinced you are. Let's blow up the condom. So everyone, almost, blew up the condom. And once they put the condom to their lips, a lot has changed in their attitude. And this multiplied. So we had school children having condom blowing championship. Children feeling very normal about contraceptives in terms of seeing it as just a normal household product.
Michai himself unwittingly became a household name. In the Thai language, a condom is now known as a Michai. Like Zimbabwe, there were songs written. This one says, "Too many children make you poor." And in ambitious Thailand, that really struck home. Today, 95% of the people want only 2 children, and 70% use birth control, about the same as Europe. Yet, also like Zimbabwe, when the program began, Michai and his colleagues found themselves up against the traditional preference for large families. One secret of Michai's success was humor. Another was clever marketing of the message, proclaiming one day a year, Cops and Rubbers Day, or paying the insurance for any taxi driver willing to dispense birth control pills or condoms from inside his cab. Michai left the government to run his irreverent campaign, but he retained full support. Even Buddhist monks were enlisted to sprinkle holy water on pills and condoms. It may all seem like good, clean fun, but for Michai and the government, this was no game. People just had to stop it, too.
In 15 years, we were able to prevent about 9 million births. Now, which means that 9 million extra people that would have been demanding various sorts of services in education and health and in urban utilities and the rest. Also, 9 million extra people could have added to a great deal more pollution, a great deal more, perhaps even political instability, because the more people you have with less and less in life, the more demanding they're going to be, the more disappointed, and perhaps even more violent. So a lot of these things are possibilities, but we are glad that we did reduce our population growth and we've speeded up our economic growth. We believe this is a crucial part of future Thai development.
Despite Michai's success, Thailand today still has 55 million people, and as a result, severe environmental problems. 50 years ago, Bangkok was known as the Venice of the East, laced by a network of canals, or klongs as they're called. People still remember the days when the city was a nice place to be. But by the early 70s, a National Environment Board had to be created.
Well, if you look back about 40, 50 years in my lifetime, when I was a young boy in Bangkok, I was born here, lived here, I could go outside my house and jump into the klong, which is small, klong means small canal. But clean, with clean water. Now, the klong still outside my house, and it's all very badly polluted. It turned into a sewer, because in those days, the population of Bangkok may be about 500,000 when I was a kid, but now 6 million.
Industrial development, especially, has brought pollution. Thousands of small sweatshops have sprung up. Their productivity is the foundation of Thailand's boom. but rivers and canals are steadily being poisoned by haphazardly dumped acids and other toxic chemicals. In response, the government recently opened a pilot waste treatment plant, but its use is voluntary, and there's a charge too. On top of that, only 3 trucks service all of Bangkok. Thailand may be reaping the benefits of industrialization, but they're paying the price too. Many of the canals have been paved over, and there's a price to pay here as well. With 1 million vehicles in the city, the government has been forced to impose air quality standards. The Environment Board now employs an air pollution specialist who realizes Bangkok is just another modern city with smog to match.
I think that we are becoming another Tokyo and Los Angeles if we do not do anything about air pollution very soon. For example, the ozone level has been increasing radically in the past 4 years that we have been monitoring. It's reaching almost to the limit, the ambient air quality standards of Thailand.
Enforcement of the standards has been lax, but recently the police, together with the National Environment Board, have been patrolling one neighborhood a day to ticket offending vehicle owners. Although the chances of being caught are still slim, given the size of the city, fines for exceeding noise and smoke limits are steep, $20 each time. But fines alone won't make people change, so the National Environment Board has turned to education. They've started leafleting to change attitudes.
We could go on ticketing people for years and could not get people to understand why. But I think that we are doing the reverse, try to get people to understand, and by that time try to step up the enforcement little by little. And we hope that if we do this together, people will understand and help us to control the pollution in Thailand.
Outside the cities, there's another Thailand, where 80% of the population lives. They depend on local resources, like forests, which have supplied their needs for hundreds of years. Trees were selectively felled and brought out by elephants without destroying the rest of the stand. The hardwood industry is a major part of the economy here, but little by little it's been outpacing the forests that have fed it. There were replanting rules, but they were ignored in the interest of profits. People assumed that there'd always be wood. Population was growing at the same time as the lumber industry. Forests gave way to farmland. In fact, in the 60s, the government actively encouraged rural people to fell trees to plant crops.
In those days, the government policy was concentrating on the development with extensive type of agriculture. Because more land was brought in for agricultural production. More land brought in means that more forest has been cleared. So that's how the forests start to decline.
It was a short-term solution that led to long-term problems. Much of the soil on deforested land could not sustain agriculture. With the trees gone, erosion set in. In no time at all, huge areas laid bare and unproductive.
Within less than 30 years, I would say, the forest has been depleted by half. This is to the policy of maximizing growth in those days. But now the government realized, I would like to say too late, but it's not too late really, but at least they realized this point that we need to do something. We need to stop just maximizing growth.
The population campaign was part of their response. But at the same time, the king was working on the problem from inside the palace. He himself never gives live interviews, but the princess, a trained scientist, agreed to speak on behalf of the family.
My father has been working for the people of Thailand. He's been king for 43 years now. And he has been working in the rural area ever since he became king.
On the palace grounds, the king has built an extraordinary royal experimental station. There is a range of technologies, many of them quite foreign. A wind-powered water pump, experiments to ferment sugarcane to produce alcohol fuel. The king introduced dairy farming to Thailand. In 1987, he celebrated his 60th birthday by starting up a new cheese-making unit. The point of these experiments is to offer his rural subjects new sources of income, and wherever possible to introduce technologies that are environmentally sound. And they are more than just experiments. This dairy project is operating in one of the poorest regions of the country. It has been a major benefit to the people. Although initially funded by the king, it now runs successfully as a cooperative. It has increased income tenfold, while at the same time introducing a new source of protein. In a nearby village, the king has revived another new source of income. Local people are taught to produce handicrafts, many of them in traditional styles which had been all but forgotten. The palace supplies the training, materials, and particularly the marketing that would otherwise not be available to people in such remote areas. The overall philosophy is to provide alternatives to exploiting the forests, and the royal family also has ideas on how to reforest, one of the government's most significant failures.
The government has tried many methods, just hiring the people to plant the forest, the young trees. And nothing worked because nobody looked after the tree. And after just one dry season, the trees died. So my mother thinks that there should be somebody to look after the young plants. And it would be very appropriate to hire the people who used to cut down the forest.
Using this approach, the royal family has been successfully replanting some parts of the country. But a major crisis suddenly made deforestation the country's #1 issue. In November 1988, catastrophic floods hit the southern part of the country, killing 400 people and leaving thousands homeless. People realized that if the forests had been there to soak up rainfall, the disaster would not have happened. There was a national outcry against logging. Responding to the popular pressure, in January 1989, Prime Minister Chatterjee declared a total logging ban, a bold move in a country where many politicians have links with the forestry business. But the same week that Parliament ratified the ban, Bangkok's port was still bustling with its log trade. Even though Thailand's forests are closed, there has been no move to stop wood manufacturing. So, to keep the industry alive, Thailand has taken to importing logs. The government has even signed supply agreements with 2 countries along the border. This sleight of hand may help Thai industries, but because of global climate, any forests matter to us all.
We stopped logging in our own country, and the government try now to import log from neighboring country, from Burma, from Laos, and so on. Some people said it's bad, but I think you have to look into 2 ways. From the national point of view, it's good because it would satisfy the demand of wood that we have in the country. But if you look in the other way, from the global point of view, it would have global problems because we stop logging in Thailand, but cutting forests elsewhere would have a total effect on the global climate.
Although it is not unknown in Thailand to set policy and then work around it, that may be changing. A growing movement has begun to demonstrate for better environmental enforcement and abandonment of destructive development projects, dams, highways, and factories. Following the pattern which began in Western countries, the popular rock group Carabao gives benefits. For environmental issues in Thailand now, the views of the people are beginning to count.
They are doing a lot of things that attract the attention of the government, at least to say to the government that before you make any decision, please stop and think carefully. This sort of thing is increasing all the time, and I think we have to accept this, that in any development, we have to accept the view of the people.
Whether popular opinion will continue to force the government to take a more active interest in environmental affairs remains to be seen. As Thailand becomes wealthier, it will have both the need and the opportunity to spend more on environmental protection. But it will also have another opportunity to avoid the pitfalls of development that other countries have already experienced. Countries like Sweden. Life in Sweden may be the best that the modern world has to offer. It's wealthy, clean, and environmentally aware. Sweden held the first International Environment Conference. You can eat fish from Stockholm Harbor, but environment doesn't stop there.
Environment is a question of quality of life, as is social stability, as is full employment, as is good education for children and culture in our daily life. And we are not interested in economic development just for its own case, but to make it possible for us to realize our dreams of what is a really good life in dignity.
A good life in dignity is within reach of all these children, not least because here there is no population problem. Like many European countries, numbers are actually shrinking, but that doesn't mean that Sweden does not have serious environmental issues to grapple with. In the 1970s, nuclear power was hotly debated. A referendum forced a total nuclear ban by 2010. It demonstrated that informed citizens can displace their governments from environmental leadership, regardless of cost. Bjorn Gillberg is a citizen activist. For 20 years, the government has tried to ignore him, even in environmentally progressive Sweden.
Well, I'll introduce myself. I'm the black sheep of Swedish ecology and biology.
Like his counterparts everywhere, Gillberg uses the media brilliantly.
Det här är alltså gräddersättningsmedel som man tar istället för några slurkar grädde i kaffe.
In one unforgettable campaign, this former government pesticide scientist set out to demonstrate the less than benign nature of food additives, like coffee whitener. He proved his point in front of TV cameras, using the whitener to wash a shirt.
Sen är det fosfat här i. Fosfaten är med för att göra vattnet mjukt. För annars får man vissa problem. Det är ett utmärkt tvättmedel egentligen.
20 years later, Gillberg is still going strong, still convinced of the essential role that ordinary people must play.
Stupid to sit down and expect governmental agencies to solve your problems. I mean, governmental agencies are nothing without people chasing them.
His latest case is against a large iron and steel manufacturer in the south of Sweden. Companies are supposed to use the best available pollution control technology, but enforcement is often lax. As part of the trial, Gillberg took the judges on a tour of every one of the 90 houses involved.
Vi börjar med att titta på fasaden här och gå runt, ja.
It's a tricky case legally, because under Swedish law, the residents can only sue for property damage, not for potential health risk. So Gillberg is careful to point out, on the houses, the dark stains and cracked paint caused by the factory's corrosive emissions. He's a master at making a simple, dramatic point. Pulling a magnet out of his pocket, he runs it through the garden soil where it attracts a mass of metallic fallout. Loaded, he tells the onlookers, with toxic contaminants like lead and cadmium. Gillberg's methods are effective. He's only lost one lawsuit in 20 years. This was to be no exception. After the first day of trial, the company installed expensive scrubbers on their stacks, a requirement the government had never enforced.
All of a sudden here, 90 families, by dragging the company to court, by putting the knife against the throat of a company, did overnight what governmental agencies did not manage to do in 20 years. So we have been successful. And this is the only language this kind of companies understand, because now it's all of a sudden a question of money. They can't pollute free any longer. They have to pay.
This is Gothenburg, Sweden's most industrialized city. It has oil refineries, car factories, and many other heavy industries. But it is also the site of a new initiative, which may show just how advanced environmental thinking here can be. It started when citizens began to complain about air pollution and traffic.
Young people, especially young mothers and fathers, have started a discussion all over the city that the air pollution is too heavy. We can't have it. We don't want our children to grow up in a city with air pollution. Tell the politicians, do something about it.
The Gothenberg Project was born. The aim was to make an environmental showplace for the nation, and the first step was to bring in a Greenpeace activist as director.
In such a developed country as Sweden, we have the possibilities to find solutions. We have educated people and we have resources and so on. So I think it's very important for us to help to show the way how to manage this modern society.
Even though the air here has only half the pollution levels of New York or London, public transportation is to be increased, and diesel buses converted to natural gas. Water quality was next on the agenda. The harbor isn't obviously polluted with the raw sewage or household garbage to be seen in Bangkok's canals, but a survey revealed something much more insidious. As Varmby expected, like virtually every body of water in the world that's next to industrial activities, there was a heavy load of chemicals, some carcinogenic. There were toxic phenols, several solvents, plastics byproducts in the shellfish and sediments.
We could see that there were a lot of these priority pollutants in both mussels and in sediments. And we suggested that we must forbid some of them and try to find some of the sources for different chemicals to take them away.
The conventional approach would be to get manufacturers to reduce their emissions. But in Gothenburg, the government tried something new. Instead, they said, why not change the product? A surprise result from the harbor survey was that a high proportion of the toxic chemicals came from ordinary household detergents. So the project decided to challenge the soap manufacturers head-on.
Manufacturers want to come to Gothenburg, and we do like that. We want them here. But we have to think about the environment. And if we know that they are using something which is not good for the environment, we have to say no. And then usually the factory says it's impossible. We must use it. We don't know anything else. And the technique isn't there yet. But if you have the geist and say, it must be like that. I have seen many, many times, if you stand by to be firm, they will come with something else.
And in this case, they did. A new detergent free of many of the harbor toxins is now undergoing stain removal tests at the laboratory at Norten, Sweden's second largest soap manufacturer. The product is not quite as effective as conventional detergent on stubborn stains like car grease. But on everyday problems like ketchup, it works fine. Consumers here are likely to regard such minor drawbacks as a small price to pay for a safer environment. The Gothenberg Project is working on advanced publicity to provide a receptive market for the nervous manufacturer. Another local company makes pipes. They are insulated with foam normally made with CFCs, the chemicals that destroy the Earth's ozone layer. The city realized that environmental responsibility is not just local, it's global as well.
It was a factory who wanted to come to Gothenburg and start producing pipes. And they were using CFC. And then we made a decision in this government in Gothenburg. You might come here, you're welcome, but you mustn't use CFC.
The company could get government funds to develop a foam made without CFCs, without Freon, the chemical's trade name. Good for the atmosphere, but what about the manufacturer? The new pipes cost about 10% more and were not an easy sell.
Buyers were very suspicious against the new product, and since we had a more expensive product as well, it has been quite tough. But it's coming more and more, and today I can say we have a promising market. We are not pleased with it yet, but it's promising.
These are the world's first CFC-free pipes, so the company will benefit as the chemicals are phased out worldwide. The Gothenberg project originated with citizen pressure, and tackling manufacturers this way is becoming national policy.
Industry has been negative to coming out with alternatives to nuclear power and fossil fuels, as they have been to the phasing out of CFCs or the new car exhaust decisions or the strict rules for coal burning, for instance, that we have introduced. And this is our general attitude, that unless government, society sets these rules, and unless we also have on the international scene global agreements to set these rules, to see to it that there are no free zones, this technical development will not come about.
There is one industry in Sweden which still escapes this kind of environmentally progressive thinking: forestry. Fully half of the nation's wealth is derived from the highly mechanized and efficient exploitation of the forest stands, which cover 60% of the land. In its dependence on trees, Sweden is really no different from the rest of the world. It's easy to forget that all of humanity ultimately relies on minerals, farmland, fresh water, forests, simple natural resources. It was the developing wood industry and pulp and paper which pulled the country out of poverty in the 19th century. But by 1900 it was clear that trees were running out. There was a deforestation crisis, not unlike Thailand's today. So in 1903, the government took an unprecedented step. The world's first law was passed mandating replanting. Today, 3 times as many trees are put back as are cut down. The future of the industry is secure. At first sight, this would appear to represent as enlightened an attitude as the Gothenberg project. But look more closely. The seedlings are lodgepole pine, an American species prized for rapid growth. For the sake of productivity, Sweden is replacing its natural forests with something else. And for biologists, that's cause for concern.
Swedish forestry is sustainable from a productive point of view. But when you look upon the biological consequences of these large-scale operations, we have to make this forest sustainable. You can be worried, because we know very little about the long-term consequences of planting. For instance, by making this ecosystem change, we are dramatically changing the virgin forest to a plantation forest that is very much like farmlands.
Biologically speaking, this may as well be a field of corn or potatoes. It's completely different from the complex mix of plants and animals found in virgin forest like this. When Ole Zachrisson brings his students out to study one of the few remaining virgin stands, they are, in effect, visiting a museum of the northern forests. It's surprising how much is still not known about the ecology of these forests, and there's less and less left to study.
Grov uppskattning är att det här trädet är omkring 400 år. Det alltså representerar en unikt hög ålder.
Now in Sweden, only a tiny fraction of original forest remains, much less than Zimbabwe or Thailand.
It's surprising that a rich country like Sweden only have less than 1% of the productive forest area under protection in national park and national reserves. It's less than hardly any other country in the world. But I think there is an an historical background to this. Forestry in this country have meant so much for the economy, for building up a good economy in this country. So we have tended to forget the other values we found in the forest.
In fact, there can be virtually no other value in these monotonous forests, as they're called, other than as commercial timber. It's easy to see how that comes about. Under government policy, Swedish forests are clear-cut to remove everything that will compete with the new seedlings. After clear-cutting, to help release the minerals that young trees need, the land is mechanically plowed. Absolutely nothing remains of the original vegetation. It's as barren as a new field. So the natural diversity of the original forest, like this, can never be reestablished, even though the replanted forest may remain untouched for 100 years. There are too many species missing. The result is that hundreds of plants and animals unique to Sweden's forests are now endangered, and will probably stay that way.
If we wanted in the future, I don't think we really could reconstruct this type of forest ecosystems, because it needs a long-term continuity to develop this kind of structure in a forest stand, with all its diversity among different species and so on. And by changing the virgin forest to plantation forest, little by little, people tend to forget how a real natural forest stand look. People driving along the roads tend to think that monotonous type of plantation forest we have over most of Sweden, that's the natural situation, but it's not that way.
Sweden's forest policy stands in sad contrast to an otherwise progressive environmental record. But it's typically Swedish to reach out to the rest of the world. Sweden can show what not to do, as well as pioneering new ideas.
We have both the responsibility and, as a rich country, the possibility of developing good alternatives. We are not an overcrowded country either, so we can afford to take on special responsibilities. On the other hand, there is a chance for developing countries that I hope that they will get to create their development without making our mistakes.
For the sake of economic development, Sweden lost its original forests. Many developing countries face similar challenges. And in Zimbabwe, the government is well aware of it. Can it teach people to recognize the value of the environment?
It's a question of life and death. They need soil, they need firewood. To them, it's not a luxury. You know, unlike in other places where you protect for romantic reasons and so on, for us, it's a question of survival. So this is why we attach so much importance. This is why even our politicians are talking a lot about maintaining our environment, because it is the basis for life in our country.
Faced with this stark reality, Zimbabwe has little alternative but to continue to exploit its natural resources in the hope that they will not fail the growing population. In Thailand, some of those resources, like forests, are already at failing point, but it's difficult to reconcile the need to conserve with the everyday needs of the people.
Environment is important, but what is equally important is the well-being of our own population. So we have to balance everything. Don't go too much into the environment, something like preserving the forest but chasing the people so they have nowhere to live. You have to optimize everything.
Sweden and the industrial countries are not faced with these direct questions of survival. They have the opportunity to develop environmentally innovative approaches to the modern world, which could be offered to developing countries. And if they choose, they also have the chance to rechannel massive resources into the world's environmental problems.
If mankind has been using most of its resources in this respect for arms race and for space research in the last 40 years, I think that we could, by concentrating all our efforts on environmentally benign technology and resource management, we will manage to solve these problems. I'm very optimistic, but it needs political decisions.
That suggestion, That money spent on defense could, in the future, go to help the environment reflects a new kind of thinking. Maybe it's possible for us to think of national security in a new way, as no longer a question of military security, but instead of the security of a healthy environment. Please join me next time for Race to Save the Planet.
Major funding for Race to Save the Planet is provided by the Annenberg CPB Project and public television viewers. Corporate funding is provided by Ocean Spray. Our continuing aim is to preserve and protect what we cannot create. Additional funding is provided by Jesse Smith Noyes Foundation, Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, and Carnegie Corporation of New York, and by the following. For more information on the college telecourse, video cassettes, off-air videotaping, and books based on the series, call 1-800-LEARNER. This is PBS. The Global Ecology Handbook, published by Beacon Press, is available for $16.95 plus shipping. A transcript of this program is available for $5. Please call 1-800-TALK-SHOW or send a check to Race to Save the Planet, Journal Graphics, 267 Broadway, New York, New York, 10007. Next on Race to Save the Planet, people taking environmental action. Kenya's farmers fighting deforestation. Russian citizens fighting air pollution. Politicians, film stars, they've all decided to help. Watch Now or Never, next time on Race to Save the Planet.